Hi everyone, and welcome to Series 2, where we talk about creating a reusable dialog for a data manipulation command. I'll quickly go through the agenda. I'll just spend a quick half a minute giving you an overview of data manipulation commands and why they're a little different. We will then talk about creating a dialog for the aggregate command, and that's a detailed demo where I'll create a reusable dialog for the aggregate command, which is in the stats package. So, when I talk about data manipulation commands, I'm talking about commands like aggregate, sort, bin, recode, and there are several others. And basically, with data manipulation commands, you're manipulating either your existing data set or creating a new data set. With existing data set, you're perhaps creating new variables or you're modifying existing variables. And with the data manipulation commands, you want the option to optionally prompt a user before overwriting an existing variable or a data set. You want the ability to refresh the data grid to show new or modified variables or the new data set. And now let's get into the demo section. We'll design a dialog for a data manipulation command, and designing a dialog involves 4 easy steps. I covered this in series 1 of the demo that I did on creating a dialog. And the first thing is your first step is you need to pick an analytical function in R or a custom function that you've developed. You need to design the dialog and map the dialog controls to the R function. So place controls like list boxes, variable lists on your dialog, and you need to map what's in those variable lists to the R function. That's number 2. Number 3 is you need to configure the dialog so it generates the R command with the parameters correctly substituted, and then you need to configure rules so users don't commit unnecessarily inadvertent, unintentional errors. So for example, if you're doing a two-step cluster, you know two-step cluster only applies to scale variables, so you don't want anyone to drag and drop a factor variables. Only numeric or scale variables should be allowed. Users should not be able to click the OK button unless all the variables or one or more variables are selected for analysis, right? If you've not selected any target variables, doesn't make sense for you to click the OK button. So simple stuff like that. So I picked up the aggregate command in the stats package. The aggregate command supports several different formats of syntax, but the one I've picked is the one that I have, that's aggregate, where X is an R object, which basically contains the variables you want in the aggregated data set. By is a list or variables that you want to aggregate by, and fun is a function to compute the summary statistics. So that's the function that's applied to the variables that you're grouping by at the variables in your data set. You're applying this function to each group at the end of the day. So I've got a sample command on the screen, and X maps to the variables in the aggregated data set or your resulting data set, and the variables to aggregate by in the by portion there. That's the second arrow. So dialog is pretty straightforward. It requires a source variable list to show you all the variables in your source data set. You require a text box to capture the name of the new aggregate data set you're going to create. You can overwrite an existing data set if you do choose to do so. A destination variable list to capture the variables in the aggregated data set. A destination variable list to capture the variables you are aggregating by. You need, we're just giving a couple of options. So typically you aggregate and you want the mean calculated for every group, or the sum, or you may want to specify a formula. So the first radio button is to capture the fact that you may want the function mean applied. The second is sum, and the third is that as soon as you click on the third radio button, we enable the text box, and you can write any function you do so desire, or just type in the name of the function and we'll apply it. on those variables. So with that, the other thing I wanted to mention is if you look carefully at the syntax at the bottom, and you look carefully at the syntax that you will write in syntax editor. The syntax above the line, or the first syntax that my mouse is over, is the syntax you would typically write down in syntax editor, and we will substitute that syntax above there by the syntax below. And you see that in the syntax you want to specify the dataset name, and the open curly braces percent dataset basically just allows you to replace the dataset on which you're running a command by the dataset object, so it gets replaced correctly. And more about that as I run into the as I cover the demo in more details. So I'll go and bring up the dialog editor application. You can go through the help. I'll skip over it for now, and I'm going to create a new function with a dialog. I know we required a source variable list, if you remember. So what we're doing is we're literally constructing this dialog here. So it required a source variable list, and I'm going to give it a name source. Every control you drag and drop on this dialog canvas needs to have a unique name. You require a text box, and I will call it txt1, and that holds the name of the aggregated data set. You require a destination variable list, and this variable list holds the variables I want in my aggregated data set. Source variable list, destination variable list. I'll just size these appropriately so they all look aligned. I will give this a name of destination 1. I will click on another destination variable list, and the second destination variable list holds all the, I'll just make the height a little longer as well to give me a little more space. So the second variable list holds the second one, let me call it destination 2, holds the variables I'm aggregating by. Size this appropriately. Okay. I'll give all these controls a helpful label. So this obviously is the source variable list. Drag this down a little bit. Label 1, give it a text of source variable list, semicolon. Create another label for the name of the aggregated data set. Label 2 is the unique name. The text is name of the space. We got the text box there. Make the text box a little wider, and this is the variables in the aggregated data set. Let's give it a label here. I will call this variables to aggregate. Oops, I'm sorry, we need to call that label 3 and give it a text of variables to aggregate. Size it appropriately. Okay, and then the other one is aggregate by. That's my fourth label, and I'll call it label 4. Alright, size it a bit. Alright, now at the bottom I just want to provide a couple of radio buttons to allow the user to select some of the most commonly used functions for aggregation. So I will call this one RD1 and we'll give it a text of mean. I'll create another radio button for the second popular function. Let's call it RD2 and let's give it a text of sum. And let's create a third radio button which really gives the person the choice to enter any other. Give it a unique name of RD3 and I'll call it other. And I can say specify for example median, standard deviation. Alright, so you can pretty much type in whatever you want. Let's size it up a bit. Now let's create a group box around it. Alright. Reduce the size a bit, move it to the left. We need to give it a little more width as well. Okay, and I want to make sure that all my radio buttons have the same group name. That's very important. Okay, that'll make sure if they don't have the same group name, if you check one radio button it won't uncheck the other one, right? So I'll give it a group name of GRP1. Okay, I'll give this one a group name of GRP1 and I'll give this one a group name of GRP1. Okay, so that's important. Okay, all your radio buttons in one group must have the same group name, and that makes sure that when you that they're all connected. So when you check one, the other radio button within the same group that was checked or enabled or that was clicked on will get unchecked. Okay, so that happens automatically. Okay, so now let me enter a text box to capture the function, and I will place this text box right here. Okay, let me resize the group box a little bit to give it a little space, and let me give it a unique name of grpbox1 and a header text of options. Alright, so I'm gonna give my dialog a title of aggregate, and I'm gonna save it. Oops, I need to give my text box control a unique property, a unique name, and I'll call it txt2 because my first text box was txt1. Oh, I need to create a move button, and that's for dragging and dropping variables to the first destination list box, and the second move button is for moving variables into the second. Okay, just make them a little smaller, just a little neater. I think we should be ready to go with the first step. So I'll give it a name of move1, give it an input name of, what was my input variable list? Source. Alright. What was my destination? Destination1. Let's go to my second, the input, let's give it a unique name of move2, input list of source, target list of destination2. Okay, so let me go ahead and save it, and I will save it to a folder here really quickly, series 3, and let me call it aggregate demo, and save. Alright, so we've sort of created the dialog that we wanted. I'm just going to do a little more sizing here. Again, to size, I click on the control and I grab it by the handles. Pretty simple, not much to it. And make this a little wider. Alright, and I'll save it. Alright, so let's go back to the PowerPoint and go to step what we need to do is we need to enter the syntax. So I've got the syntax of the command copied here in my notepad, which I'm going to paste here. Okay, and let's do some substitutions. Now remember, the aggregate, the resulting data set, which the aggregate or the new data set that the aggregate command will create will come from the first text box. Okay, so I'll double click on the first text box because that's the name of my aggregated data set. The second or the variables in my aggregated data set will come from my first variable list. So I'll replace it by that, and my aggregated by variables will come from my second variable list. So I'll double click on that, and my function can come from three places: either the first radio button if it's checked. If it's not checked, it won't come from that. The second radio button. Okay. Oops, I'm sorry, these are getting appended to the wrong place. I accidentally moved my mouse. It's the second radio button and the text box. Okay, that contains my formula. So if I've selected my first radio button, the value from my first radio button will be replaced into the function. If I select my second radio button, the contents of that radio button will be replaced, and radio button 1 and text will be empty. And if I've selected the third radio button, the entry that I type into the text box is what's replaced here. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. I'm going to save, and then let's go back to the third part. So in the third part, I configure the dialog so that it generates the R command with the parameters correctly substituted. In my text box for the name of the aggregated data set, I want whatever I type into the aggregate as my aggregated data set name to be replaced into this control here. The same applies to the other text box. If I select the radio button other, this text box should get enabled, and whatever I type in should automatically get substituted in this control here at the bottom. The variables to aggregate by, they get replaced here into the destination one, and I want to enclose the variable names by a colon and use a comma to separate the variables, so I'll select that option. Now the variables that I want to aggregate by, I want each of those variables to get replaced in this syntax parameter in the format var1 equals dataset $var1. Okay, so I want it substituted in that parameter, and I'll choose that option, and I'll show you that pretty quickly here. And the other thing is I will set the syntax property to mean for the mean radio button or RD1, and I'll set the syntax property to sum for RD2. And in order to make sure that the active data set is replaced in my syntax command, I will make sure that I have a curly bracket percent data set, right? So that should be fairly straightforward. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. I click on my text box, and the substitute setting is text as is. I click my variables to aggregate by, and go to my substitute settings, because that tells me how the variables within this control will be substituted. And I say that I do not want a prefix. I want to enclose the variable name by a single colon. So that's the one I need to choose, and use comma is already selected for me. So that's all good. I select my third data set. My third variable list, and I go to substitute settings, and here I want to make sure that each variable is replaced in my syntax in the format var1 is equal to dataset var1 and use comma, and I'm pretty much done. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save. Oh, I forgot about my radio buttons. Let me select my first radio button. I want this one to be selected by default, so I want to set is selected to true. Also, when this is selected, I want it to pass a parameter of mean. I'll go to my second radio button. I want is selected, or the default property of is selected, to be false. Let's make sure I got is selected true here. Yeah, the second one, radio button, I don't want it to be selected by default, and I want the syntax to be mean. My third radio button, I want is selected to be false, and I'm not really worried about the syntax because I need to keep the syntax as blank, because if it's selected, I don't want anything passed, because what I want happening, and that's very important, the third radio button, I need to keep the syntax blank, because when it's selected, I don't want any value from this radio button being substituted in the syntax. I want the value of this text box to be substituted in the syntax. Okay, so do remember to keep this one, the syntax of the third radio button control, which is driving the enablement of the text box, and to true. Okay, so just to recap that, remember that when the third radio button is selected, it is the contents of the text box that have valid values. Both these get replaced by an empty string, okay, or nothing. All right, so I will go ahead and save, and then let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right, I believe I've completed most of the steps. So let's make sure that we got the data set properly set in the syntax. Yep, that's what we forgot to do. So I want to make sure that the active data set gets replaced here. And in order to do that, I do a percent. We go back to my PowerPoint, data set percent. Data set percent. Yeah, and that will make sure that the data set name gets replaced there. Okay, so I will save it, and then let's go back to the PowerPoint and move to our next slide. So in step 4, I need to configure rules so users don't commit inadvertent errors. All right, so obviously if someone has not specified the name of an aggregated data set, I don't want them to be able to click the OK button. I want to disable the OK button. Also, if they've entered the name of that data set and that data set exists, I may want to prompt the user to telling them that, do you really want to overwrite the data set? So I want to set that property as well. The variables that I want in my aggregated data set, or the variables to aggregate, if nobody has selected a variable in this list box, I want to disable the OK button. And I also want to make sure that only scale variables can be dragged and dropped into this, because it doesn't make sense for me to drag and drop as factor variable. And the third destination list box or variable list box and variable list are interchangeable here. If there are no variables that I'm aggregating by, it doesn't make sense for the OK button to be disabled. Here in this case, I only want to allow factor variables as well. And here I also want to click a couple of controls just to make sure I have a good user interface, right? So as soon as I click mean, I want the text box to be disabled. When I click sum, I want the text box to be disabled and cleared if it has anything. And when I click on the radio button close to other, I want the text box to be enabled and cleared as well. So we can set up those rules. Okay, so I'll just quickly introduce some properties. The can execute property is a property available on all controls except labels and move buttons. The OK button on a dialog is enabled only when every control on that dialog has can execute is equal to true, and I'll show you the can execute property in a minute. If you need more details, look at the series 1 demo tutorial that I've uploaded. And if any control has can execute set to false, the OK button is disabled. Also, the enabled property is another property that's available on several of the controls, and if it is true, that control is enabled and the user can interact with that control, and if it is false, it's disabled and the user cannot interact with that control. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go back to the demo and set the following rules. So if the name of the aggregated data set is specified, so if there's a valid name for the aggregated data set, I want to set can execute to true. However, if there's no invalid name, can execute should be set to false. I need to negate what I just wrote, or what I've said here is needs to be inverted. The second point is if the list of variables in the aggregated data set is empty, set can execute to false. If there are one or more variables selected, set can execute to true. Again, if a list of variables to aggregate by is empty, set can execute to false. If the list of variables to aggregate by contains one or more variables, set can execute to true. Okay, so fairly straightforward. As well as the rules for mean and sum, which I'll show you in the demo. Okay, so let's go back to the demo. All right, so now the first thing I'm going to do is define a rule that, so the first thing I want to do is when I bring up this dialog the first time it's executed, I want to make sure can execute is set to false. Okay, that's because this control is blank when it is when the dialog comes up the first time, and I want someone to populate it. Okay, and then what I'll do is I will define a rule that says if the text property is a valid string, I will set the can execute property of the text1 control to true. Okay, so initially when the dialog comes up, I want the OK button disabled because nobody has entered the name of the aggregated dataset. As soon as somebody enters a valid string in the name of the aggregated dataset, I will set can execute to true. All right, in the same way, the first time this dialog comes up, the variables to aggregate is empty, so I want to set can execute to false. However, as soon as somebody drags a valid variable in, I will set a rule as soon as the count goes to 1 or greater to make can execute to true. Okay, so we can do that very easily. We will say the property name is items count. Okay, if item count is greater than 0, I will set the control name is destination 1, property name is can execute, and I will set it to true. And I'll add another rule that says when item count equals 0, that means there's no items in this control, I want to set can execute to false. Okay, so I want the control name that I want to set the property to false is destination 1, property name is can execute, and I want to set it to false. Okay, so let me just review the rules here really quickly. All right, so if it's a valid string, can execute is set to true. I think I forgot to set a rule. I need to add one more rule, and that is if the text property is null or empty, I want to set can execute to false. Okay, I forgot to set that. The control is text1. So let me go back. I've probably been going really quick. Okay, so I'm back to the name of the aggregated data set, and I'm saying is if the text property, that's this property here, is or nobody's entered any text there, and if it's null or empty, I want to make can execute. Oops, the control name is txt1, the property name is can execute, and the value is false. So this will handle the fact that someone's entered a valid aggregate a valid string in the aggregated data set name, but then they've backspaced and cleared it out, and whenever they've done that, I want can execute to be set to false because there's no valid name specified in the aggregated data set. Okay, so that should do the trick. Now let me set the rules for the aggregated by list box or destination 2. Again, if item count or there are no items in this control, I want to set can execute to false. However, if there's one or more item, I want to set can execute to true. All right, and initially I want to make can execute false as well. Okay, because the first time I come in, all these three controls are empty, and I need a value populated in these controls to be able to enable my OK button. So let me go into define rules. Very simple. If my item count property is equal to 0, items count is nothing but the number of items in this control. I'll go in and set property of can to false, and if item count is greater than 0, I will set can execute property name can, and I will set it to true. Alright, and then here when the mean radio button is selected, I want to disable this text box. Okay, so what I need to do is go back to my rule for the first radio button, and what I want to do is say if is selected, because that's the is selected property that becomes true when it's selected. I want to go and set the control txt, the property name enabled, and I want to make it false. Okay, so as soon as that radio button is selected, I want to make the enabled property of txt2 to false. Okay, what I also want to do is make the text property to the empty string. Okay, so it clears out that control. I want to do the same thing for the second one. So if I've selected the second radio button, I want to disable the text box control, and the property name is selected, and I want to make sure that make this enabled property false. Okay, and actually I want to do one more thing. I also want to clear out any text that someone may have entered. That's the text property. I want to leave it empty. Okay, and when this control is enabled, that's the other radio button is selected, I want to enable the text box. So is selected equals to true. I want the text box property name enabled. I want to set it to true. Alright, so that should pretty much tie it up. What I'm going to do now is preview the dialog and let's see if things work as we expected it. Okay, great. OK button is disabled. I will type in a name here. It's still disabled. I now drag and drop a variable into my variables to aggregate by. Still disabled, which is good. I now select a variable to aggregate by and my OK button becomes enabled. I move it away, the OK button is disabled. I add it back, the OK button becomes enabled. In the same way right now, oh, one thing I forgot. So basically I should not, if my mean is selected, I do not want to be able to enter any text here because I'm using the mean function. So I'll cancel it. So I need to go back to my text box and I need to make sure that can execute is set to false. Okay, so that is important. And then I need to go back to my room for, or rather I shouldn't make can execute to false. I will just set, I will make keep that to true, but I'm thinking I will set the enabled property to false. So the first time this dialog displays, I don't want to be able to enter anything there. I can't type in any text. It's only when I click on this that I can type any text. Okay, and the same time when I click on mean, this text should go away, and I should not be able to type anything there. The same way I click on sum, it's still disabled, right? So that's important. So therefore, the first time this dialog comes up, I want this text box to be disabled, and hence I've set enabled to false for the first time this dialog comes up. Okay, so things are working pretty well with the dialog. I'll preview it one more time for you. So you see the first time it comes up, this control is enabled. As soon as I click other, this control gets enabled. And the OK button is only enabled when I have a valid value here. When I enter a valid here. Now the other thing is I should never be able to drag and drop a scale variable here. So let's go and make that change. So I'm going to click on my list box control, and I want to go into filter settings, because what I want to say is I should only allow scale variables here. Okay, so I want nominal and ordinal removed. Okay, and here on the other hand, I want to make sure that I just have factor variables. So I don't want any scale variables here. Okay, so that should do the trick. I'll preview it one more time, and let me try and move a nominal variable, two variables to aggregate by, and I get a message saying it doesn't allow it. And let me do the same thing here. Sorry, let me try and drag and drop a scale variable to aggregate by, and I get the message. So things are looking pretty good. Let's go back to the PowerPoint and let's think about designing the output. Now, as the aggregate command does not need any tabular output, we don't need to use the BlueSky format command. However, what we want to do is load up the newly aggregated data set into the grid, and the command BlueSky load refresh data frame handles this. Okay, before we do that, I have to there's one thing that we needed to do. We needed to set the override property. Now, if somebody enters an aggregated data set and the data set automatically already exists, you want to prompt the user. Okay, so you want to prompt the user telling him that this data set already exists. So that's a property we forgot to set. Okay, so in the event that someone enters the name of that data set and that data set already exists, we prompt him that saying this data set already exists. Do you want to overwrite it? Okay, so that's straightforward. Coming back to the output. So the aggregate command does not need any tabular output, so we do not need the BlueSky format command. However, we want to load the newly aggregated data set into the grid, and the command BlueSky load refresh data frame handles that. That's a little typo there. I've got BlueSky twice, and that needs to be corrected. And if you look at the syntax, this is what the syntax needs to look like. So let's go back to the syntax editor, and let's add another line. I've just copied it here. So what we need to do is just add a line here. So the first command generates the aggregated data set. The second line loads it in the grid. Okay, and let's save it. And a quick overview of the syntax when the command runs. Just take a look at it. And now let's go to install the dialog. So basically, if the R function is already available in an existing package loaded by the BlueSky application, you can inspect the dialog in the BlueSky application and go into Tools, Dialog Editor, and install it. I've shown you how to do this in Series 1. I'll quickly go through this very quickly here. And if you want to see what packages you have installed, go to Tool Packages, Show, and you can go. You can see the installed packages as well as the loaded packages. Okay, so let us save this, close it, and let's launch the BlueSky application. I launched the, oops, I'm sorry, there it is. I missed it. Too many windows open. But now I can go into Tools, Inspect Dialog, and here's my aggregated demo. I can just open it up, and there I see my aggregated dialog. I see the syntax. If I want to take a look at it, it all looks good. Okay, and I can go into Tools, Dialog Installer, and I don't want to overwrite my existing aggregates, so I am going to either create a quick category called test and install it there, or you know what, I'll just put it under data, and I will say install new command, and I'll say aggregated demo, and here I have the aggregate demo. I'll click OK, and I have to close down my application, and I'll restart it again. And I will open up my data set, and let me go ahead and run the aggregate demo. There you see my dialog comes up. I can give it a name of test. I can select both these two variables, select my aggregate by, select mean, and run it. Oh, I have an error, and I have an issue because my mean is not found, so I have to type in the value for mean correctly. I believe it is lowercase. You got to remember that R is case sensitive, and in order to do that, all I need to do is just go ahead and open up the dialog, and instead of capital mean, I can type in small case mean. I believe that is my error. It's either that or it is average, and if I reinstall, everything will work fine. So what I can do is I can just run that again, and I can show you the syntax. So you can run the syntax, and to figure out what the right command is, let me make this lowercase mean, and let's see if it runs this time. All right, it did. And now let me see if I can refresh it. Okay, and that worked. Okay, so here's my aggregated data set. So the mistake I made is that I typed in a lowercase mean instead of an uppercase mean, and that can be very easily corrected by going into the dialog editor program and making that change. Okay, so let's go back to the the application. Let me launch the dialog editor really quickly here. And I just want to show you the change I made. This was the change I made. This was the mistake. The mean here needed to be lowercase, just to reiterate that. And now let's go back to the options. So in Weaver case one, the aggregate command was in the stats package, which was already loaded. But if the R function is available in a package that is not installed, then you need to install the package. You need to load the package. If you want to load the package permanently every time the application installs, you've got to go to this setting. That's option, configuration, settings, default packages. So I can show you that really quickly. Options, configuration, settings, default packages. These are the packages that get loaded from our whenever the BlueSky Statistics application is installed, and these are the packages that get installed on demand. So when I want the packages installed on demand, I go into package and I say load user session packages. So all the packages that I have set here are the packages that get loaded on demand when I choose that option I just showed you. So back to the PowerPoint, and then there's no R package, then you need to create a package and follow the instructions in case 2. So to summarize, I've given you an overview of a data manipulation command that creates a new data set. We talked about the property that on a text box that tells you whether you want to prompt the user if the data set already exists. Other data manipulation commands will modify variables. You can prompt the user if you want those variables to be overwritten. And I can show you that. In fact, I can demo that. I forgot to demo that to you really quickly. So let's run the same command again. So we'll run the aggregate one more time, and now you see the data set. You know the data set already exists, so let's run it, and then you see the command. You get prompted saying, do you want to overwrite the data set? That's because of that property, and I say no, and obviously the command doesn't run when I don't want that data set to be overwritten because it's already there. So that's a very important property which is here. I'll just show it to you, override settings, and that gives me the option to prompt the user before overwriting a data set that already exists. So that's it for the most part. The aggregate dialog is in the sample dialogs folder. You're welcome to review it, look at the rules, look at how it's laid out, change it, do what you need, install it, reinstall it, and obviously, if you want to get familiar with some of the basics in Dialog Editor, look at the Series 1 video, look at Series 2, which has several parts to it. Take a look at that, and the next one is creating reusable dialogues with graphic output, and then creating a command without a dialog with tabular output. And then I've got the last Series 6 demo where we create a reusable dialog with tabular output and for a complex R statistical function which involves graphical output. So thank you very much for listening, and we will be posting these shortly. And with any questions, obviously happy to help you guys out. Email us at support@blueskystatistics.com. Thanks again.